Marcus fought desperately against Henderson's grip, but the larger man's strength was overwhelming. As Henderson dragged him across the chamber, Marcus managed to grab his radio and press the emergency button, sending out a distress signal that would alert all units in the area to his exact GPS coordinates. The signal was weak this deep underground, but it might be enough to guide rescue teams to his location. Henderson threw Marcus against the wall near his trophy display and pulled out a length of rope from his supplies. "You know what your problem is?" he said conversationally as he began preparing restraints. "You think you're the hero of this story, but down here in my domain I decide who lives and who dies." While Henderson was focused on the rope, Marcus noticed that the unconscious woman was becoming more alert. Her eyes were open now, though she appeared confused and disoriented. Marcus caught her attention and gestured silently toward the passage opening, hoping she would understand that she needed to try to escape while Henderson was distracted. The woman, who looked to be in her early 20s with shoulder-length blonde hair, seemed to grasp the situation quickly despite her obvious trauma. She began moving slowly and quietly toward the passage, staying low and keeping to the shadows. Marcus knew he needed to keep Henderson's attention focused on him to give her the best chance of escape. "How many people have you killed?" Marcus asked, genuinely wanting to know but also trying to distract Henderson from noticing the escaping woman. "How many families are still wondering what happened to their daughters, their sisters?" Henderson paused in his rope work and smiled, an expression that was more frightening than his anger had been. "You really want to know? 15. 15 beautiful young women who made the mistake of trusting a stranger who asked for help." He gestured toward his trophy display. "Each one taught me something new about fear, about control, about the exact moment when hope dies in someone's eyes." The casual way Henderson discussed his victims made Marcus feel sick, but it also gave him crucial information. 15 victims meant this had been going on much longer than anyone had suspected. There were probably missing person reports spanning multiple states, and families who had been searching for answers for years. The blonde woman had made it to the passage opening and was slowly disappearing into the darkness. Marcus felt a surge of relief, knowing that at least one potential victim would escape Henderson's clutches, but his situation was becoming more desperate by the moment. Henderson finished preparing the restraints and moved toward Marcus with obvious intent. "Here's what's going to happen," Henderson said, his voice taking on a tone that Marcus recognized from his work with trauma victims. The calm, controlled speech of someone who had done terrible things many times before. "You're going to be my guest for a while. I need to relocate my operation anyway, thanks to your interference. You can help me move my collection to a new location." Marcus understood that Henderson was talking about the remains and personal belongings of his victims. The thought of being forced to participate in desecrating the resting places of murdered women filled him with a rage that overcame his fear. When Henderson reached for him with the rope, Marcus exploded into action. He grabbed a heavy camping lantern from the nearby supplies and swung it as hard as he could at Henderson's head. The impact made a sickening sound, and Henderson staggered backward, blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. But the larger man didn't go down. Instead, he roared with anger and charged at Marcus like an enraged bull. The collision sent both men crashing into the trophy display, scattering personal belongings across the chamber floor. Marcus found himself pinned beneath Henderson's weight, with the killer's hands reaching for his throat again. But now Marcus was fighting not just for his own life, but for justice for all of Henderson's victims. As they struggled, Marcus managed to grab a sharp piece of broken camping equipment and drive it into Henderson's shoulder. The man screamed and rolled away, giving Marcus the opportunity to scramble to his feet. Blood was flowing freely from Henderson's shoulder wound, but he was still very much a threat. "You're dead," Henderson screamed, his calm demeanor completely gone now. "Do you hear me? You're dead." He pulled a large hunting knife from his belt and advanced on Marcus with murder in his eyes. Marcus backed away, looking desperately for anything he could use as a weapon or shield. His hand fell on one of the personal items from the trophy display, a small metal cross on a chain that had probably belonged to one of Henderson's victims. The sight of it filled Marcus with determination. These women deserved justice, and he might be their only chance to get it. As Henderson lunged with the knife, Marcus dodged to the side and grabbed the camping stove, which still had a fuel canister attached. He twisted the valve open and began spraying fuel at Henderson, while backing toward the passage opening. The smell of propane filled the chamber, and Marcus knew he was taking a dangerous gamble. Henderson realized what Marcus was planning and tried to rush him before he could ignite the fuel. But Marcus had anticipated this. He grabbed his emergency flare from his belt and pulled the ignition cord just as Henderson reached him. The flare burst into brilliant red light, and Marcus threw it toward the area where he had sprayed the most fuel. The result was immediate and terrifying. A wall of flame erupted between them, cutting off Henderson's attack, but also blocking Marcus's primary escape route. Henderson screamed as the flames singed his clothing and forced him back toward his trophy display. The fire was spreading quickly, fed by camping supplies and other flammable materials that Henderson had stored in the chamber. Marcus realized that his escape plan might have trapped them both in a burning cave. But then he heard the most beautiful sound he had ever experienced, the distant echo of voices calling his name. Jake had returned with backup, and they were somewhere in the passage system, following the signal from his emergency beacon. Marcus began shouting back, trying to guide them to his location while also watching Henderson through the flames. The fire was creating thick smoke that filled the chamber and made breathing difficult. Henderson was coughing violently and seemed to be weakening from his injuries and the smoke inhalation. But he was still dangerous, and Marcus knew that rescue teams wouldn't be able to reach them safely until the fire was under control. Marcus made another desperate decision. He grabbed one of Henderson's water containers and began trying to create a path through the flames, dousing the fire in strategic locations to allow for escape. The voices in the passages were getting closer, and he could see flashlight beams reflecting off the smoke. When the first rescue worker appeared through the smoke, Marcus had never been happier to see another human being. But Henderson wasn't finished yet. With his last reserves of strength, the wounded killer made one final lunge at Marcus, the hunting knife still clutched in his hand. The smell grew stronger as Marcus continued down the passage, and he had to fight the urge to turn back. His search and rescue training had exposed him to many unpleasant situations, but this was different. This wasn't an accident or a natural death. This was evidence of something evil that had been hidden in the darkness for far too long. The passage opened into a large natural chamber, much bigger than the previous ones. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed a space that had been converted into a grotesque living area. There were camping supplies, a portable stove, sleeping bags, and shelves carved into the rock walls. But what dominated the chamber was something that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Along one wall, arranged with horrifying precision, were personal belongings that clearly came from multiple victims. Purses, jewelry, pieces of clothing, and identification cards were displayed like trophies. Marcus counted items that appeared to belong to at least 8 different women, spanning what looked like several years based on the varying styles and conditions of the objects. In the back corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a makeshift curtain made from a tarp, was the source of the terrible smell. Marcus forced himself to investigate, knowing that each piece of evidence might be crucial for bringing justice to Henderson's victims. What he found there confirmed his worst fears: the remains of at least 2 people in various stages of decomposition. Marcus documented everything with his camera, fighting back nausea as he worked. The methodical way the personal belongings were arranged suggested that Henderson wasn't just a killer, but someone who took pleasure in reliving his crimes. This chamber was his private museum, a place where he could return to remember each victim. As Marcus continued his investigation, he heard something that made him switch off his flashlight immediately: the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through the passage. Henderson was returning, and Marcus was trapped in the killer's private chamber with nowhere to hide. The chamber was large, but most of it was open space with few places to conceal himself. Marcus quickly moved toward the back of the chamber, positioning himself behind some camping equipment near the wall. He could hear Henderson's footsteps getting closer, accompanied by what sounded like dragging or scraping. The man was bringing something with him, and Marcus had a terrible suspicion about what it might be. Light appeared in the passage opening, and Henderson entered the chamber. From his hiding spot, Marcus could see that the man was dragging a large duffel bag that appeared to be heavy. Henderson seemed agitated and was muttering to himself as he moved around the chamber, clearly upset about losing Sarah and discovering that his hideout had been compromised. Henderson dropped the duffel bag near the center of the chamber and began gathering items from his trophy display. He was packing quickly, obviously planning to abandon this location permanently. Marcus realized this might be his only chance to see what was in the bag, and he carefully shifted position to get a better view. When Henderson unzipped the bag, Marcus had to bite his lip to keep from making a sound. Inside was another woman, unconscious but alive. She appeared to be young, with blonde hair, and she was wearing hiking clothes that suggested she had been taken recently. Henderson had already claimed another victim while Sarah was escaping. The sight of the unconscious woman filled Marcus with a rage he had never experienced before. This monster had been operating in their area for years, taking innocent people and subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. Every instinct told Marcus to attack Henderson immediately, but he forced himself to think strategically. He was outweighed by at least 50 pounds, and Henderson was clearly comfortable with violence. Marcus quietly activated his emergency beacon, hoping that the signal would penetrate the rock and reach the surface. He also tried to get a clear photo of Henderson with his phone, though the lighting conditions made it difficult. Every piece of evidence could be crucial if Henderson managed to escape. Henderson finished packing his most important trophies and turned his attention to the unconscious woman. He was preparing to move her again, probably to one of the other chambers that Sarah had mentioned. Marcus knew this was his best opportunity to act, while Henderson was distracted with moving the victim. Marcus made his decision. He couldn't let Henderson leave with another victim, regardless of the personal risk. He had his radio, his emergency beacon was active, and backup should be arriving soon. If he could create enough of a disturbance, perhaps he could buy time for help to arrive. Marcus stood up from his hiding place and shined his powerful flashlight directly at Henderson, temporarily blinding the man. "Search and rescue!" he shouted. "You're surrounded." "Release the woman and surrender immediately." Henderson spun around, shielding his eyes from the bright light. For a moment he seemed confused and disoriented, clearly not expecting to encounter anyone in his private chamber. But then his expression changed to one of cold calculation, and Marcus realized he had just made himself the target of a very dangerous predator. "Well, well," Henderson said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Looks like I've got myself another volunteer." He began moving slowly toward Marcus, his hands raised as if to surrender. But his body language suggested he was preparing to attack. Marcus kept the light trained on Henderson's face, while reaching for his radio with his other hand. "Multiple units are already in the canyon," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You can't escape. The best thing you can do now is surrender peacefully." Henderson laughed, a sound that was devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Boy, you have no idea what you've walked into. This canyon has been my home for 3 years. I know every passage, every chamber, every way in and out. Your friends will never find you down here." The unconscious woman began to stir, making soft, moaning sounds that echoed off the chamber walls. Henderson glanced toward her briefly, and in that moment Marcus saw his chance. He lunged forward, hoping to tackle Henderson before the larger man could react. But Henderson had been expecting the attack. He sidestepped Marcus's charge and delivered a powerful blow to his midsection that sent him crashing into the rocky wall. The flashlight flew from Marcus's hand and skittered across the floor, its beam creating wild shadows as it spun. Marcus hit the wall hard and felt the air rush out of his lungs. Henderson was on him immediately, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him partially off the ground. The man was even stronger than Marcus had expected, and his grip felt like a steel vise around Marcus's neck. "You made a big mistake coming here alone, hero," Henderson growled. "But don't worry, you're going to have plenty of time to regret it." He dragged Marcus toward the area where he had been keeping his trophies, and Marcus realized with growing horror that he was about to become the latest addition to Henderson's collection. Marcus made the difficult decision to split their small team. Jake would escort Sarah back through the passages toward the main canyon, where they could signal for medical evacuation and law enforcement backup. Meanwhile, Marcus would remain behind to gather evidence and watch for the return of Sarah's captor. It was a risky plan, but they couldn't afford to let this man escape to potentially harm others. Before Jake and Sarah departed, Marcus carefully documented the chamber where they had found her. He photographed the ropes that had been used to restrain her, the makeshift bedding area, and several personal items that clearly belonged to the captor. Among these was a wallet that had apparently fallen from the man's pocket during one of his visits. Marcus carefully examined it without touching, noting the driver's license visible through the clear plastic window. The name read, William Henderson, with an address from a town about 2 hours' drive from the canyon. Sarah was barely able to walk, but with Jake's support, she could move slowly through the passages. Before they left, she provided Marcus with more crucial information about the canyon system. According to her captor, there were at least 3 other chambers deeper in the cave network where he had hidden supplies and equipment. More importantly, Sarah believed there might be evidence of other victims in those locations. After Jake and Sarah disappeared into the narrow passage, Marcus found himself alone in the eerie chamber. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the constant dripping of water and his own careful movements as he continued to search for evidence. He found a small notebook that had been wedged behind a rock, apparently dropped accidentally. The pages contained dates, descriptions of locations within the canyon, and most chilling of all, what appeared to be a tally system with multiple hash marks. Marcus photographed each page of the notebook with his phone, though he wasn't sure the images would be clear enough in the low light. The entries went back over 2 years, suggesting that William Henderson had been using this canyon system as his base of operations for a long time. Some entries contained initials and brief physical descriptions that could only refer to victims. As Marcus continued his investigation, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the scraping of boots on rock, coming from one of the other passage openings. Someone was approaching, and from the heavy, confident footsteps, it wasn't Jake returning with help. Marcus quickly switched off his flashlight and pressed himself against the chamber wall, trying to control his breathing as the footsteps grew closer. A beam of light appeared in the passage opening, sweeping back and forth as the person searched the chamber. Marcus could hear heavy breathing and what sounded like someone dragging something across the rocky floor. The light moved systematically around the chamber, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was only a matter of seconds before he would be discovered. The man's voice broke the silence, rough and angry. "Sarah, where are you, girl? I brought food like I promised." The light beam continued its search, and Marcus could see that the man was indeed large and powerfully built, just as Sarah had described. He was carrying a heavy backpack and what appeared to be a coil of rope. When the beam of light reached the spot where Sarah had been restrained, the man stopped. Marcus could hear him cursing under his breath as he realized his prisoner had escaped. The light began moving more frantically now, searching every corner of the chamber. Marcus knew he had only moments before he would be discovered, and he was acutely aware that he was probably no match for this man in a physical confrontation. The light beam swept toward Marcus's hiding spot, and for a moment he was certain he had been seen. But then the man's attention was caught by something else, the evidence that Marcus had been photographing. The wallet, the notebook, and other items were still where Marcus had found them, but now they were clearly disturbed from their original positions. William Henderson's voice carried a new tone now, not just anger but genuine concern. He understood that someone had been here, someone who had taken his prisoner and discovered his secrets. Marcus could hear him moving around the chamber more urgently, gathering up his belongings and preparing to leave quickly. This was Marcus's chance. While Henderson was distracted with packing his things, Marcus managed to move quietly to a different position in the chamber, one that would give him a better view of the man and potentially allow him to follow when Henderson left. He activated his radio on its lowest setting and whispered a brief update to his base station, hoping the signal would get through. Henderson finished gathering his belongings and stood in the center of the chamber, clearly trying to decide what to do next. Marcus could see him more clearly now, a man in his mid-40s with the scarred hands that Sarah had described, wearing military-style clothing and boots. Everything about his demeanor suggested someone who was comfortable with violence and accustomed to being in control of dangerous situations. After a few moments of consideration, Henderson chose one of the passage openings that Marcus had not yet explored and disappeared into it. Marcus waited several minutes to ensure the man was truly gone before activating his flashlight again. He quickly gathered as much evidence as he could carry, including the notebook and several other items that might help law enforcement identify additional victims. The passage that Henderson had taken led deeper into the canyon system, away from the route that Jake and Sarah had used to escape. Marcus faced a crucial decision. He could follow Henderson and try to discover the other chambers that Sarah had mentioned, potentially finding evidence of additional victims, or he could retreat to safety and wait for law enforcement backup. The responsible choice would have been to retreat and wait for help. Marcus was alone, potentially facing a dangerous predator on unfamiliar ground, but he also knew that Henderson was likely to disappear completely if given the chance, possibly to establish a new base of operations where he could continue harming people. The evidence they had found suggested that multiple women had fallen victim to this man, and there might be others still missing. Marcus made his choice. He would follow Henderson, but at a safe distance, trying to map out the deeper sections of the canyon system and locate the other chambers. He had enough water and supplies to last several hours, and his emergency beacon would bring help if he got into serious trouble. More importantly, he had a moral obligation to do everything possible to ensure that Henderson didn't escape justice. The passage that Henderson had taken was different from the others Marcus had explored. It sloped downward steadily, leading deeper underground. The walls were smoother here, carved by centuries of water flow, and there were fewer places to hide if he encountered Henderson coming back. Marcus moved as quietly as possible, pausing frequently to listen for any sounds ahead. After about 15 minutes of careful movement, Marcus began to smell something that made his stomach clench, the unmistakable odor of decay. The passage was leading him toward something that had been dead for a long time, and he was beginning to understand that the true scope of Henderson's crimes was far worse than anyone had imagined. The passage opened into a wider chamber after about 50 yards of squeezing through the narrow walls. Marcus emerged first, sweeping his flashlight beam across the space to get his bearings. The chamber was roughly circular, about the size of a small bedroom with several other passages leading off in different directions. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, creating a small pool in the center of the rocky floor. Jake emerged behind him, breathing heavily from the tight squeeze. Both men stood quietly for a moment, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate human presence. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the steady dripping of water and their own breathing. Marcus noticed that the air had a different quality here, mustier and more confined than in the main canyon. The beam of Marcus's flashlight caught something that made him freeze. There, pressed into the soft mud near the water pool, was a clear handprint. It was small and delicate, obviously belonging to a woman, but what made his blood run cold was the way the fingers were spread wide, as if the person had been trying to brace themselves or had fallen hard onto their hands. Jake saw it too and pointed his own light at the surrounding area. They found more evidence of disturbance, scuff marks in the dirt, a torn piece of fabric caught on a sharp edge of rock, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be drag marks leading toward one of the passage openings. The marks were accompanied by those same heavy boot prints they had seen outside. Marcus pulled out his radio and tried to contact their base station, but the signal was too weak this deep in the canyon system. He made a note of their exact location and the evidence they had found, knowing that documentation would be crucial if this turned out to be something more serious than a simple rescue situation. They chose to follow the drag marks, which led into the largest of the passage openings. This tunnel was taller than the previous one, allowing them to walk upright, but it curved sharply to the left after only a few steps, making it impossible to see very far ahead. The walls here showed more signs of recent disturbance, with scratches and scrapes that looked fresh. About 100 yards into the passage, they heard it, a sound so faint that at first Marcus thought he might have imagined it. But then it came again, a weak moaning that seemed to echo from somewhere ahead of them. Both men froze and listened intently. The sound came a third time, definitely human, definitely female, and filled with pain. Marcus motioned for Jake to stay back while he moved forward more quickly, but still cautiously. The passage continued to curve, and the moaning sounds grew slightly stronger. His heart was pounding now, not just from exertion, but from the growing certainty that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a hiking accident. The passage opened into another chamber, this one much larger than the first. Marcus's flashlight beam swept across the space and immediately found its target. There, huddled against the far wall, was a woman. She was sitting with her back against the rock, her knees drawn up to her chest, and even from a distance Marcus could see that she was in bad shape. He called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, we're with search and rescue. You're going to be okay now." The woman's head lifted slowly, and when the light reached her face, Marcus had to fight back a gasp. She was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair that was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her face was bruised and swollen, and her eyes held a mixture of relief and terror that Marcus had never seen before. Jake appeared beside him, and together they approached the woman carefully. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Marcus knelt down beside her and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he told her. "We're going to get you out of here." As he began to assess her injuries, the full scope of what had happened started to become clear. This wasn't an accident. The woman had been beaten, and from the marks on her wrists and ankles it was obvious that she had been restrained. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she appeared to be suffering from dehydration and exposure, in addition to her other injuries. Marcus radioed Jake to start preparing for an emergency medical evacuation, while he began basic first aid. The woman was conscious but weak, and she kept trying to tell them something. Marcus leaned closer to hear her whispered words, and what she said made his blood run cold. "He's coming back," she whispered urgently. "He said he would come back." Her eyes darted toward the passage opening they had just come through, filled with terror. "He's not done with me yet." Marcus felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the cool air in the chamber. Whoever had done this to the woman might still be in the area. He quickly radioed Jake with a code that meant they needed backup immediately, and that they might be dealing with a dangerous situation. Jake acknowledged and began setting up a defensive position near the chamber entrance. The woman, who introduced herself weakly as Sarah, had been missing for 3 days. She had been hiking alone when a man approached her, claiming to be lost and asking for help with directions. When she stopped to assist him, he had attacked her and dragged her into the canyon system. For 3 days he had kept her prisoner in various chambers throughout the caves, returning periodically with water and food, but also subjecting her to psychological and physical torture. According to Sarah, her captor had left early that morning, saying he was going to get supplies and would return by evening. He had tied her up in the chamber where they found her, but she had managed to work free of the ropes after hours of struggle. Her escape attempt had been motivated by desperation and the growing certainty that the man intended to kill her eventually. Marcus worked quickly to stabilize Sarah while keeping one ear tuned for any sounds that might indicate someone approaching. Jake had positioned himself where he could watch both the passage they had come through and the other openings that led out of the chamber. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute, and Marcus knew they needed to get Sarah out of the canyon system as quickly as possible. As he helped Sarah drink small sips of water from his canteen, she continued to provide details about her captor. He was a large man, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and distinctive scars on his hands. He knew the canyon system well, suggesting he had been here many times before. Most disturbing of all, Sarah believed that she was not his first victim. During her captivity, he had made references to others and had shown a level of organization and preparation that suggested this was not his first kidnapping. The implications of what Sarah was telling them were staggering. They might be dealing with a serial predator who had been using the isolated canyon system as his hunting ground for months or even years. Marcus realized that their rescue mission had just become something much more complex and dangerous. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished tying the last knot on the climbing rope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky canyon walls, and the desert air was already warming up despite the early hour. He had been working as a search and rescue volunteer for over 5 years, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the urgency in the dispatcher's voice when the call came in, or perhaps it was the location itself. Devil's Canyon had claimed more lives than any other spot in their territory. The call had come in at dawn. A woman's voice, barely audible through static and panic, had managed to reach emergency services before her phone died. All they knew was that someone was trapped somewhere in the canyon system, and time was running out. The dispatcher had tried calling back multiple times, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Cell towers in the area were spotty at best, and the canyon's depth made communication nearly impossible. Marcus adjusted his helmet and checked his equipment one final time. His partner Jake was already rappelling down the first section of the canyon wall, his bright orange vest a stark contrast against the weathered red rock. They had divided the search area based on the approximate location the cell tower had triangulated. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all they had. The canyon stretched for miles in both directions with countless side passages and hidden alcoves where someone could easily become lost or injured. Flash floods were common during the rainy season, and even experienced hikers sometimes found themselves in trouble when the weather turned. The rock formations were beautiful but treacherous, with loose stones and hidden crevices that could trap an unwary climber. As Marcus began his descent, he couldn't shake the feeling that this rescue would be different from the others. There had been something haunting about the woman's voice on the recording the dispatcher had played for them during the briefing. It wasn't just fear or panic. There had been an undertone of something else. Desperation, maybe, or resignation. The rope felt solid beneath his gloved hands as he controlled his descent down the canyon wall. Each step required careful placement as the sandstone could crumble without warning. Years of wind and water erosion had created a maze of tunnels and chambers throughout the canyon system. Some were large enough to walk through, while others were barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Marcus paused on a narrow ledge about halfway down the first section. From this vantage point, he could see for miles across the desert landscape. The morning was clear, with unlimited visibility, but the canyon itself remained shrouded in shadow. He pulled out his radio and tried to contact Jake, but got only static in return. The radio communication would be spotty until they reached the canyon floor. As he continued his descent, Marcus thought about the other rescues he had been part of over the years. There had been successful saves that filled him with pride and purpose, but there had also been recoveries that haunted his dreams. The teenage rock climber who had fallen and broken both legs, stranded for 3 days before they found him. The elderly man who had suffered a heart attack while hiking alone and wasn't discovered until it was too late. Each case taught him something new about survival, human nature, and the thin line between life and death in the wilderness. The canyon floor was cooler than the rim, with a small stream running through the center. The water was clear and cold, fed by underground springs that had carved this passage through solid rock over millions of years. Marcus landed softly on the sandy bottom and immediately began scanning for any signs of human presence. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, pieces of clothing or equipment, anything that might indicate which direction to search. Jake's voice crackled through the radio as communication improved. He had found something about a quarter-mile downstream, what looked like a makeshift campsite that had been abandoned recently. Marcus made his way quickly along the stream bed, his boots splashing through the shallow water. The walls of the canyon rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a sense of isolation that was both beautiful and unnerving. When he reached Jake's location, Marcus could see what had caught his partner's attention. There were clear signs that someone had spent time here recently. A small fire pit with cold ashes, some scattered food wrappers, and most importantly, a woman's hiking boot print in the soft sand near the water's edge. The print was relatively fresh, probably made within the last day or two. Jake pointed to a narrow passage that branched off from the main canyon. The opening was partially hidden behind a large boulder, and it would be easy for someone to miss unless they were looking carefully. The woman's footprints led directly toward this passage, but they were joined by something else that made both men pause. There were other prints as well, larger, deeper impressions that suggested someone much heavier had been walking alongside her. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon's cool air. This wasn't starting to look like a simple hiking accident or someone who had gotten lost. The evidence suggested that the woman might not have been alone, and that whoever had been with her might not have had her best interests in mind. He radioed their location back to base and requested additional backup, though he knew it would take time for more teams to reach their position. The narrow passage stretched into darkness ahead of them. Marcus pulled out his high-powered flashlight and illuminated the path. The walls were smooth and worn, carved by centuries of flash floods. There were scrape marks on the rock that looked recent, as if someone had been dragging something heavy through the passage. More concerning were what appeared to be drops of dried blood on some of the rocks. As they prepared to enter the passage, Marcus checked his equipment one more time. His rope, carabiners, first aid kit, water, and emergency beacon were all secure and easily accessible. Jake did the same, and they established their communication protocol. If either of them lost radio contact, they would retreat immediately and wait for backup. The passage was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and in some places they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The walls pressed in around them, and the silence was broken only by their breathing and the distant sound of dripping water. Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam dancing across the rock walls as they penetrated deeper into the canyon's hidden arteries. The rescue worker who appeared through the smoke was Jake, accompanied by 2 law enforcement officers and another search and rescue team member. They had followed Marcus's emergency beacon signal and the sound of his voice through the maze of passages. When they saw Henderson lunging at Marcus with the knife, one of the officers immediately drew his weapon. "Drop the knife! Police!" the officer shouted. But Henderson was beyond reasoning. His face was a mask of blood and rage, and he seemed determined to take Marcus down with him even if it meant his own death. The knife came within inches of Marcus's chest before the officer was forced to fire. The gunshot echoed deafeningly through the chamber, and Henderson collapsed to the rocky floor. The hunting knife clattered away into the darkness, finally ending the immediate threat. Marcus stood there shaking, covered in smoke and blood, hardly able to believe that his ordeal was finally over. Jake immediately began working to extinguish the remaining flames while the officers secured the scene. The second law enforcement officer began documenting everything with his camera, clearly recognizing that they had stumbled upon something much larger than a simple rescue operation. The trophy display, the personal belongings, and the evidence of multiple victims would require a massive investigation. Marcus briefed the team on everything he had discovered, including the notebook with Henderson's records and the location where he had found evidence of remains. The blonde woman who had escaped during the fight was located about halfway back to the main canyon, conscious but traumatized. She identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, a college student who had been hiking alone when Henderson approached her the previous day. As emergency medical personnel arrived to treat the victims and process the scene, Marcus learned more about the scope of Henderson's crimes. The investigation that followed would eventually link him to missing person cases across 4 different states. The notebook that Marcus had found contained detailed records of each abduction, including dates, locations, and descriptions of the victims. Sarah, the first victim they had rescued, provided crucial testimony about Henderson's methods and the other locations he had mentioned during her captivity. Her information led investigators to 2 additional chambers deeper in the canyon system, where they found more evidence and, tragically, the remains of several other victims. The personal belongings in Henderson's trophy display became the key to identifying many of the victims and bringing closure to families who had been searching for answers for years. Driver's licenses, jewelry, and other personal items helped authorities match the evidence to missing person reports dating back over 3 years. Marcus spent several hours giving detailed statements to investigators and FBI agents who had been called in to handle the multi-state aspects of the case. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, and even though Henderson had died in the chamber, the investigation would help solve numerous cold cases and bring peace to many families. In the weeks that followed, Marcus received commendations from multiple law enforcement agencies for his role in exposing Henderson's crimes, but the recognition felt hollow compared to the satisfaction of knowing that no more innocent women would fall victim to the predator who had used the canyon system as his hunting ground. The blonde woman, Jennifer, made a full recovery and became an advocate for hiking safety and awareness. She often spoke about the importance of letting others know your planned route and timeline when venturing into remote areas. Sarah also recovered, though she carried emotional scars that would take much longer to heal. Both women credited Marcus with saving their lives and the lives of potential future victims. The canyon system itself was temporarily closed to the public while investigators completed their work. When it reopened months later, new safety measures were in place, including emergency communication stations and regular patrols by park rangers. A memorial was erected near the main entrance, honoring the memory of Henderson's victims and serving as a reminder of the importance of looking out for one another in the wilderness. Marcus continued his work with search and rescue, but the experience in the canyon had changed him profoundly. He became an instructor, teaching other volunteers about recognizing signs that a missing person case might involve foul play rather than simple accident or exposure. His training programs emphasized the importance of maintaining communication with base stations and never attempting solo rescues in potentially dangerous situations. The investigation ultimately identified 15 victims, exactly as Henderson had boasted to Marcus in the chamber. Families from across the region finally had answers about their missing loved ones, and several cold cases that had frustrated law enforcement for years were finally closed. The evidence collected from Henderson's chamber provided closure for dozens of people who had been living with uncertainty and grief. Marcus often thought about that moment when he had to decide whether to follow Henderson deeper into the canyon or retreat to safety. The choice to pursue the killer had nearly cost him his life, but it had also prevented future tragedies and brought justice to victims who might otherwise have been forgotten forever. Years later, when Marcus told the story to new search and rescue volunteers, he always emphasized that heroism wasn't about being fearless or taking unnecessary risks. True heroism was about making difficult choices in impossible situations and being willing to act when others needed help. Even when the personal cost might be high, the canyon returned to being a place of natural beauty rather than hidden horror, but Marcus never forgot the lessons he learned in those dark chambers. Every rescue call reminded him that behind every plea for help was a human being whose life hung in the balance, and that sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival could come down to the actions of a single person willing to answer that call. The memorial at the canyon entrance bore a simple inscription that Marcus had helped write. In memory of those who were lost and in honor of those who never stopped looking for them. It served as a reminder that even in the darkest places, there were people willing to shine a light and bring others safely home.